there's you talked about the availability heuristic and some of the role that the press might be playing, the fact that negative events stand out. We can also see negative events all over the world now. So, and we can't think of all over the world. Whenever you hear about a negative event, it's as if it's happening next door and is a threat. So the breadth of our news is exaggerated and the coverage is exaggerated, but there still seems to me to be this mystery at the bottom of all this, which is in the face of such radically good news, why is there such an insistence that the system is corrupt, that we're going to hell in a handbasket, and that human beings are a cancer on the planet and everything is heading towards the apocalypse? It's so deep, and it doesn't seem to be moved by the facts much. I kind of think sometimes that it's a hangover from the Cold War, that was so deeply pessimistic for so long.
It goes back before the Cold War. Certainly as a psychological syndrome, it goes back at least to the Old Testament prophets, who combined kind of social criticism with foretelling an apocalyptic disaster. So that syndrome, that combination of moral scolding with predictions of doom, is something that our species quite naturally falls into. Mm-hmm. Part of it is, I think, frankly, a certain amount of interprofessional competition, that society has various elites. There's the politicians, the business people, the military, the religious elites, the academics, the journalists. They're always kind of competing for status. And since intellectuals don't deserve a whole lot of credit for getting society to run, for putting food in the stores and keeping the peace and protecting the streets, it's very easy to look down on other societal elites, on government, on business, and to say, well, you guys are all failing and we're the ones who are morally refined enough to point it out. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't put down just sheer human competitiveness. I'm not the first to say this. One of my favorite explanations of the veneration of the past, of golden ages, comes from Thomas Hobbes, who said, "Competition of praise inclineth to a reverence of antiquity, for men contend with the living, not with the dead."
Yeah, well, it also seems that there's a certain amount of resentment that is driving that as well, and that would go along with the status competition, because there's anger, I suppose, if you're the member of an elite group, to see that your paradigm, let's say, isn't leading the charge forward.
That's right. And you talked about the astonishing decline in global poverty. And part of that story is it did not come about through massive redistribution, which for many people on the left was the only route to lifting up the poor, namely to redistribute resources. Now, there have been, of course, adjustments, even shocks. The fact that China and India and Bangladesh and Indonesia have risen out of poverty came in part at the expense of manufacturing jobs in the United States.
Yeah.
That's not exactly what people meant by redistribution, and it literally isn't redistribution of resources, although it is a shaking up of the economies of many nations. But this massive increase in the wealth of Asian countries did not come because resources were shipped from the wealthy West to the impoverished East.
Right, so that's also a threat to the doctrine itself, a direct threat. The fact that wealth is being produced and it's being distributed to people at the low end implies that redistributive philosophy is likely in error. And you can understand why that might be regarded as a catastrophic threat, particularly to people on the radical left.
Well, certainly for radical notions of redistribution. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the more limited kinds of redistribution that are ubiquitous in wealthy countries. I have a graph showing that the proportion of GDP allocated to social spending skyrocketed in the 20th century from about 1% to about 22% mm-hmm. in every developed country, no exceptions. And thanks to spending on the poor, on children, on the sick, on the unlucky, rates of absolute poverty have fallen in wealthy countries. So not only has the developing world become wealthier, and not directly at the expense of the developing capital. But within the developed world, thanks to some amount of social spending, I guess you could call it redistribution, even as inequality has risen, poverty has not.
Right. Right. I wonder, I was just reading a book by Walter Scheidel called The Great Leveler.
Yeah,
Which
very
is
good.
a
Excellent
study.
book.
It is an excellent book. And one of the things he did was an empirical analysis of left versus right wing governments, I think across the 20th century, but it might have gone farther back than that, to see if there was any difference in the Gini coefficient across the classes of government. And what he found was that there was no difference whatsoever. And he makes a fairly strong case that the only redistributive techniques that work are pestilence and war, essentially. And that's because they knock everyone down to zero. But you're making a different case, like an incremental case in some sense, which is that governments, perhaps regardless of their ideological proclivities in the 20th century, as they've become more wealthy, they have incrementally devoted a larger part of their resources to incremental improvements in, you might think about it as investment in the future rather than redistribution, or investment in social capital, education and healthcare and those sorts of things. That
Well, it's probably some combination. It's a combination of investment in public goods, because of course the whole society is better off if everyone's educated. Also insurance. People support a safety net. That's the most popular euphemism for social spending, because you never know whether it's going to be you or your mother or your brother who's going to be in need in the lottery of misfortune. And then part of it is charity. The modern conscience won't allow the little match girl to freeze to death.
right.
Or the Jodes to bury grandpa by the side of Route 66. And so I think social spending has been pushed along by all three.
Right.
It hasn't necessarily, in some countries, it probably has reduced the Gini coefficient. In Western European countries, which have a more aggressive system of taxation than the United States or Canada. But more important than the Gini distribution is that it's reduced the number of people living in poverty, which I argue is the morally relevant measure in any case.
Yeah, well, those two things are complicated because obviously you want to raise people out of abject poverty. I mean, that's a zero argument proposition, and that seems to be happening very rapidly. The question after that, I suppose, is to what degree does the remaining degree of inequality that's generated by productive capitalist systems also constitute a social threat? Because there is evidence, I think it was reviewed best in the Spirit level, that as inequality increases, rates of male homicide, for example, increase, and all sorts of other negative measures. So there's some weird interaction between raising absolute levels of wealth and ensuring that inequality doesn't, I don't know, exceed some hypothetical optimum that needs to be considered in social policy. And
yeah, I cite some skeptical reanalyses of the data in the Spirit level, and probably absolute prosperity matters more than inequality in determining social health, such as happiness, crime, other kinds of social pathologies like drug addictions. It's not easy to tease them apart.
No, definitely not.
Countries like Sweden are very egalitarian, but they're also very rich. And
right.
Uganda are more lopsided, but they're also very poor. And so it takes a little bit of statistical wizardry to tie them apart. And my reading of the literature is that it's actually prosperity that is more important than inequality. But also, and this is a point that in the psychological literature was emphasized by Christina Starmans and Paul Bloom, that what people sometimes think of as an aversion to inequality, to people having different amounts, is actually an aversion to unfairness.
Right, to injustice.
That what really infuriates people is that they think that the people at the top have ill-gotten gains.
Right.
People, if they sense that the system is basically fair, that either greater effort, talent, or even luck result in an unequal distribution, an impartial lottery, for example, they're okay with that. It's cheating that really gets under.
Yeah, and people are really good at remembering cheating and recognizing it as well, and it sticks in the